Welcome to Chattanooga Civics. I'm Nathan Bird. It's no secret that transportation is one of the most pressing issues in Chattanooga. Whenever a new development is proposed, the first question most people ask is, what about the traffic? So how does the city plan for growth? It turns out it's a much longer and more in-depth process than I ever realized. I sat down with Melissa Taylor and Caroline Daigle, representatives of the Chattanooga-Hamilton County, North Georgia Transportation Planning Organization, to find out more about their work on the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan. The process to write the 2050 plan kicked off in December of 2020 and will run through 2024. In our interview, we talk about how the plan is written and how Chattanoogans can make their voices heard throughout the process.
Hello, I'm Melissa Taylor. I'm the Director of Strategic Long-Range Planning in the Regional Planning Agency that staffs the Transportation Planning Organization.
I'm Caroline Daigle. I'm a Senior Planner with the Regional Planning Agency and Transportation Planning Organization. We could probably start calling it the TPO. What do you think?
Yes. So going forward, TPO, Transportation Planning Organization. Let's start there. I know this interview is mainly going to be about the Regional Transportation Plan, and we'll get into that, but let's start with just the TPO in general. What is it? What do y'all do?
So I'll take that one. In general, the Transportation Planning Organization is the federal pipeline of funds for our area. So it's organized and structured by a mandate from the federal government, and it has a 28-member board that oversees the activities, and the executive director of the Regional Planning Agency, which is staffed to the TPO, actually is secretary to the board. So that's how our staff comes into play, and we program all the federal money that comes into this region.
Great. And so who are the other stakeholders in the TPO in general? I know y'all are part of the Hamilton County Regional Planning Organization. Are there any other stakeholders in the TPO?
Absolutely.
How are they bundled in?
I would say that everyone is a stakeholder. All of the citizens in the region, so that covers all of Hamilton County and portions of North Georgia. Okay. So we have a portion of Dade County, a portion of Walker County, and then all of Catoosa County. So all of the citizens within that boundary. Organizations that we partner with, a variety. I think we have probably about 50 members on our Community Advisory Committee meeting for the Long Range Transportation Plan, which would be the organizations that we would work with most. A lot of businesses and, as I mentioned, just an average individual citizen.
And just to provide a little bit more context, the TPO isn't unique to Chattanooga. Every urbanized area in the country above a certain size has a metropolitan planning organization. So the acronym MPO, it might be familiar to people that have lived in other cities. We call it the TPO here, but every city and urban area above a certain size gives these boundaries.
250,000 people constitutes the threshold for the Metropolitan Planning Organization. So.
And then is the TPO an authoritative body or an advisory body or kind of a mix as far as? It's
a legal entity, so when it takes action, it is final. The board takes that final action on all of the products.
Great. And so we're here today to talk mostly about the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan, which is something you all have kind of kicked off the process for. Just tell us very generally about what is that plan, and we'll get into some questions about that.
So overall, the Regional Transportation Plan sets the blueprint of intended projects and funding for 20 plus years. And that 20 plus years could be 23 years, it could be 25 years, it just depends on the cycle because it has to be 20-year horizon. And we like to use that terminology because we're looking out into the future, so the horizon of the plan is 20 years, at least 20 years, to meet the federal regulations. So there are a lot of things that go into a regional transportation plan, a lot of federally mandated requirements. When we mentioned the 250,000 people threshold, that's for transportation management area for an MPO or our TPO. And so in the planning process, we have to do public involvement and get people's input on what they'd like to see. It also covers a lot of other federally mandated things like performance measures. So what are we measuring about the system, and what types of projects should meet the needs of the system, and that kind of thing in general. Trying to think a little bit more about overview of what somebody would want to know coming into it, never hearing about a transportation plan before. I would say that we hear a lot about congestion, and so part of that process is also the congestion management plan. And we have staff in the agency that focuses specifically on that work as well.
Right.
And the RTP kind of takes projected funding, from now with this 20 to 25 year horizon and programs it for projects. So there's a project list, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's a big part of the RTP is looking at that project list, and projects are kind of put into different tiers that closer years in and further years out, and there's money kind of tied to the plan in that sense as well, because it's a fiscally constrained list. So like the checkbook has got to balance out in the plan.
So that leads me to two questions. What is that fiscal constraint? Who determines what that is? And I guess the overall budget for the plan, but then also that project list. Can you explain how many of those projects actually get implemented and how that is decided? So let's start with the first one. Where does that budgetary constraint come from?
So we build the revenue stream for the plan.
Okay.
We have a methodology that's approved by Federal Highway that sets the stage for how do we create the revenue of the plan. And a lot of it is historic expenditures, but then also just expected allocations from the federal transportation legislation. So when we build that revenue stream, we build it out 20 plus years. And then we begin to program projects from funding sources. So the federal government has a variety of funding categories. And only certain projects are eligible in certain categories. And so when we start to look at that, then it really matters kind of what kind of projects you're getting in the call for projects from the TPO membership, which every jurisdiction in that boundary that I mentioned earlier submits projects or has the ability to submit projects, along with some other organizations, and then like transit agency also submits projects, because Federal Highway and FTA are the two funding pipelines for transportation. So once those projects come in, then they have to have a method by which, as Caroline mentioned, which ones get selected. So we have a project evaluation process for
so that fiscal constraint that the TPO comes up with is federal and state and local funds all kind of bundled together and saying, here's what our budget is.
It is, because a lot of those programs require a match that are funding projects. So sometimes it's 20%, 10%. Sometimes the state has to contribute, and all that gets fiscally constrained. And we try to do it in what we call three tiers, so that we're not costing out projects that just get unwieldy to build because they become too expensive because of inflation. And so you want to set up, hey, if we set up this first tier, say the tier is 5 years in the beginning, 3 to 5 years, and then your 5 year, or 10 year type of tiers, then you can fiscally constrain a set of projects. Much easier if you've got a smaller set within a certain timeline.
So the plan is for these projects, it's the 2050 regional transportation plan. Does that mean that these projects won't come on board until 2050, or is the idea that these projects are in place and actually getting themselves worked into the system between now and 2050 and kind of analyzing? That's your analysis period rather than your building period.
So that's a good question, because actually you could think of the plan itself as mostly all virtual reality, I guess, or it's it's kind of unclear in terms of what will actually make it into the building phase, because that changes, and we do a plan every 5 years. So that can change. You have you can have anywhere from 150 to 200 projects in the plan, fiscally constrained.
Right.
But moving them into implementation is up in the air. The ones that are not so much up in the air are probably the ones that make it in the first tier. So when we talk about the 2050 plan, that's going to be the 2030 time frame. So you got 2030,
right.
2040, 2050.
Right.
And so that 2030 is the one that you would expect to see projects from that list moving into what we call the Transportation Improvement Program, which was sort of the next discussion point of your question to
so
how did
I've
they get to the bill.
I'm glad you spelled out the whole phrase, but the TIP, the implementation plan that talks about what projects actually get chosen from the regional transportation plan to the implementation plan, what are the ones that actually gets built. What does that process look like in terms of choosing which programs make the cut?
So when in the RTP, when we do the project evaluation, we're ranking them, which is what ends up funding them in the tiers. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of ends up being sort of the ranked list, or what you consider those pots of ranked projects and what we would expect to move more quickly than others. And then from that, they move into the Transportation Improvement Program through another call for projects.
So basically, all the jurisdictions in the TPO that submit a set of projects for the RTP, they might submit, let's say, 50 projects for consideration, and 25 of them, end up in that fiscally constrained list. And then from that list, from what's in the RTP, they choose what to submit into the TIP and what to pull into that short-term implementation plan. And usually, like Melissa said, it's those ones that are in the earlier tiers that, there's flexibility for jurisdictions. As long as the funding balances out and a plan is in the RTP, they can change their priorities, because we know that priorities change over time and realities change. And, a project that was in the 2045 plan, RTP, especially the ones in later tiers, might not roll over into the 2050 plan if the jurisdiction sponsoring it no longer, wants to pursue that project. And so there's a lot of the onus on the jurisdictions, to set their priorities and pull what comes from the RTP into the TIP. So the TIP doesn't exist without the RTP, and everything in the TIP has to be in the RTP first.
Okay.
But then in the TIP, that's where you have the shorter term implementation, kind of what's getting action taken on it today. And that action might not mean, orange construction cones on the ground. It could just be we're doing a design study or a NEPA phase, but there's still got to be funding pulled from the plan to apply to those phases of the project. So one metaphor that we use that I think explains it pretty well is, if you've got, for example, like a reading list for a course that you're taking for a whole year, right? Like a course at college or something. And day one, you get the whole reading list for the entire course. You don't go to the library that day and check out every single book on that list and start reading every single book. You get a subset for the first couple of weeks, work your way through, go back and return for more. And so the RTP is kind of like that full list. And then the TIP is, what are we working our way through now to make make progress towards that overall set of goals that we have?
Okay. So that leads me to another question is, if a project doesn't make it into the RTP, does that jurisdiction then have to wait until the next, I guess it's a 5-year cycle roughly, so they have to wait 5 years to get it into the next plan? Or how does that work? If something comes up, say an Amazon warehouse gets built.
Or VW, because
it's
a good example.
Something happens, a company just comes and drops a big plant in, and now what do you do? Right.
So there is an amendment process. Okay. And it's detailed. Most of the processes that we would have a need to do within the processes are usually federally mandated, and we have to set up a process for that. So in our RTP, there's actually a section in the plan that talks about the amendment process. So because it's staff time, resource intensive, we've developed that our process is what we call a biennial amendment. So every the 2 years after the plan's adopted, then we do a call for projects for changes, and any of
the water, make sure
any of the jurisdictions that have changes, or there's something coming online that we may not be aware of, or even if we are, we'll have conversations with them about, this is what we've got coming up, we're going to add it. Does anyone else have any other changes that they want to add? There's just a lot that goes into the bigger projects. There's a lot of modeling, travel demand modeling that has to be done, and those time frames are just long in terms of getting it all organized and getting the projects and doing the analysis and then getting them amended into the plan. So it's hard to do it on any more frequent basis than that, though we have.
Right.
And we'll do it as quickly as we can, but sometimes it can take anywhere from 6 months to a year to do an amendment for one project.
Right.
And so we typically do want to do more of them all at once to make sure that we're being efficient with our time and resources.
And in addition to that, there is flexibility kind of built into the process from the beginning. And so for projects that kind of alter the way the transportation system operates, like adding a new road, widening a road, that requires these, biennial amendments, that requires more intensive modeling. But Melissa's done a really good job in her history leading this process to build flexibility into it with things called set-asides and groupings for certain types of projects. So it's kind of a bucket of funds that, for example, there's a maintenance set-aside or a bike ped set-aside, and this is a bucket of funds that jurisdictions can, not every project will be, a discrete line item, putting sidewalks on Shallowford Road from X point to X point. It's not, sometimes a project on a line item is just repaving various streets in the city of Chattanooga, and that's from a maintenance set-aside. It's a bucket. And then the jurisdiction can pull funding that relates to repaving various streets, and they prioritize and decide what streets do we need to do sooner rather than later, and that doesn't require...
And that's an easier move into the TIP.
Exactly.
Because there's not any amendment that would have to happen, and it just builds it naturally into expediting the expenditure of those funds. So, and that can be done with a variety of projects that don't require the modeling or the more intensive requirements that the bigger roadway projects might require.
You're not doing heavy engineering or traffic impact studies or anything.
Exactly.
Building a sidewalk or
That's right.
Got it.
And those have been typically, and actually there weren't, some of the smaller jurisdictions for several years weren't feeling that like they could tap into these federal funds because they saw it as a pretty extensive process. They they might not have a need for a big roadway project, and they were thinking about a signalization project. And so when we created the set-asides and set it up to be a more kind of direct process for them to just ask for money in the TIP when they needed to do resurfacing or the signal system, like a signalization project, like I mentioned, then that opened the door for them, and we began to see more projects from the smaller jurisdictions asking for funds and being able to do, a few projects in a 3 or 4 year period that were useful and needed in their areas.
And so I know, just kind of looking through the RTP documents and things that are starting to become publicly available, that there's a lot of different inputs that go into this in terms of, we've talked a lot about different jurisdictions bringing a project. How much of that process is driven by, city officials and, regional planning departments or CDOT or organizations like that? And then how much is driven by citizens? Just, how can just regular people give their input to the RTP, and how is that weighted in the process, I suppose? How strongly are individual requests kind of considered?
So, and first off, in terms of the officials on our TBI Executive Board and the Technical Coordinating Committee, there's representatives from all of the jurisdictions. So from each, from the city of Chattanooga, from the city of Red Bank, city of Eastridge, Hamilton County, Catoosa County, everybody's got a seat on that board and a vote, for adopting the plan, adopting the project list and the plan. And we work really closely with our TPO membership throughout the development of the RTP. Melissa facilitates the call for projects with the designated TPO members, and she'll even take time to have one-on-one conversations with, let's look at what's in the plan already for your jurisdiction, what you might want to roll over, what might be moving out, and has those conversations at the front end of the plan. However, there's also a lot of public input that directly informs the RTP, and that's especially, and I think we're going to get to some talk about how we kind of weight the projects and the scales that we use, and public input is especially related to that aspect of the plan. So we actually have a survey live right now where we're asking people to, rank priorities for transportation investments across, it's either 7 or 8 different categories, and it's kind of hard choices, and so that's why we ask people to rank it, because we can't just say everything's equally important, because then we won't be able to prioritize funding, and that's what we really need to do. There's unlimited needs if we wanted to address every single need, but there's limited funding, so it's got to be prioritized. So we ask people to rank their priorities. We ask people to indicate, for projects of different types, like a project in your neighborhood versus a project that brings you, to Cleveland or Dalton or neighboring regions. Like it's the transportation system's kind of operating in a different way at those different scales. And so even within each scale, which Melissa will talk about here in a minute, we ask people to rank what their priorities would be for investments at those different levels. And then also just influencing, the goals and the vision of the plan, and everything nests under that. So there's a lot of there's a direct pipeline between what we hear from people, how we, weight those priorities when we evaluate projects, and the projects that end up getting ranked the highest in the process and get presented to the board. Ultimately, the staff presents a project list and the RTP to the executive board, and they vote on it. So they could vote on the staff recommendation, they could rank their own. I think there's a process where the membership can do their own ranking, right, Melissa?
There is, and we like to leave the decision with the decision-making board. So we try very hard to provide a set of ranked projects that we're saying, hey, we have enough money to fiscally constrain this set of ranked 1 projects, ranked 2 projects, ranked 3, and they're kind of in these groupings of just this many projects in each of those ranked levels. And then when it goes to the board, they have the opportunity to be, but there's a really important project for us that, one jurisdiction might say it's really important to us. I noticed that it made it in the 3rd list. We'd like to move that up. We feel like it's going to be of benefit to us, and they have the right to do that. It's part of the process, and we've accommodated that, and we've had that situation happen. But I would say that more often than not, the data-driven, the analysis-driven approach to how we select those projects in the first place and they get ranked, they see as beneficial, and they're always interested by it. And the unique method that we have actually allows small projects to compete and win out over much larger projects. And it's just about the purpose behind the project and which one is the best performing project. And so we get a really good mix of projects when we finalize the list. And that's pretty unique for us. It's actually been a process that's been recognized as a Transportation Planning Excellence Award from the federal government for MPOs. And so there are a lot of other places that are kind of tailoring or trying to use our framework that we've established for that in their own way. Ours is really tailored to here because, as Caroline mentioned, there was a lot of public process that went into why did we choose that method, or how did we get where we are with that framework. So I would hope that it's unique elsewhere too. But
so how are those board members chosen? I know you said each jurisdiction kind of sends a board member. Is it a single board member for each jurisdiction, or is it weighted by population size? And then does each jurisdiction kind of have its own control over who they send?
So they each have a seat as the mayor or the elected commissioner of a county, let's say.
Right. Okay.
So as that elected official, that's the seat on the board.
Okay.
Okay, and then the recommending body, which I failed to mention earlier, is the technical coordinating committee, and they have they can have themselves as the designee on that, or they can designate someone from Public Works, let's say, to serve on the technical committee. They can also designate someone to serve on the board as well.
Right, so it's the mayor,
but it is
the kind of legal seat, but then they can name
the elected representation,
a designated representative to go forward.
And so we probably have about half and half, would you say, designated seat, designated representatives versus the actual elected officials that sit on the board.
The smaller jurisdictions tend to send their mayors or their county official, county commissioner, and the bigger tend to send a designee.
Right, that makes sense.
I'm not. I don't know if it would be about half and half.
Yeah, it's a mix.
It might seem that between the TCC and the board, though.
Yeah,
like if we think about them both, that's the membership. Maybe thinking about it that way.
Right.
Between both of the board and the TCC, that might be more in line.
And then we've kind of come full circle here, back to just kind of public participation. You mentioned the survey that's online. I took it a few days ago while I was preparing for the interview, and I thought it was really well laid out. And so I kind of want to talk about that survey, but then I also want to talk about, you have a couple interactive maps that are on the Regional Transportation Plan website that I thought were really interesting. So the survey itself is just kind of more open-ended. Rank where you want your spending, rank what kind of projects you want to see, input. It's fairly self-explanatory. And so I definitely invite the listeners to go check that out, and that'll be in the show notes. But then I want to talk about these kind of more interactive maps. There's one that allowed you to kind of put places of interest onto a map and say, like, this is where I'm trying to get to. And then you can kind of aggregate that and see, like, where are the destination spots. And then you also have one for cyclists. And I think there's one more that I might have missed.
Yes. So I think there might be 4 as of a couple days ago. But there's the map for identifying community resources, which is identifying these destinations. One about level of traffic stress that we've kind of framed around people who are biking, but also applies to people walking, the way that we're using that analysis. One about equity emphasis areas and what we're doing with equity in the plan. And then one about kind of understanding the transportation improvement program and the relationship between the TIP and the RTP. So all of those, there's story maps. We're using a really new approach that we haven't done in the past with this plan that we're really excited about, to have a designated project website and get a little bit more into the weeds in a more user-friendly way to almost like de-wonkify a little bit of this stuff and just make it easier for people to see, you know, the on-the-ground reality of how does this relate to me? How does providing my input in this process, you know, influence or potentially influence the type of projects that get built in my neighborhood? So I can talk about those input opportunities briefly, each one. For community resources, we are identifying places in the TPO area that are, you know, essential community resources. So thinking parks, grocery stores, schools, social service centers are things that we've added as well. Public libraries. There's, I think, 9 categories, so I'm forgetting a few off the top of my head. But these sort of destinations that are the places where, you know, outside of your commute, the trips that you're taking on a you know, normal basis are going to mainly be to these types of places. And we're wanting to identify where are all these resources so that when we get a set of projects to evaluate, we can look at the ones that are really promoting safe access to those resources and safe multimodal access. So providing opportunities for people to get from their neighborhood to a park or from their neighborhood to a grocery store, maybe by walking or by biking or by transit, to take, some of those trips off the road if there's a close connection that can be made. And so identifying those resources and bringing that to the public to make sure, hey, did we miss anything? Is there anything, I actually put all those story maps together, and I'm pulling from a couple different data sources to get these points, and, nothing is necessarily exhaustive. And so getting input from people to make sure that we didn't miss anything is really important for that process. For the equity emphasis areas, we are similarly trying to identify, what are the areas in the TPO that we need to have a particular focus on from an equity lens and from an equity perspective in the plan. So there's, a federal requirement to address environmental justice in transportation planning, as in all federal programs that receive funding, and then to also look at, transportation disadvantaged communities. So just communities that have a difficult time or more of a challenge using the transportation system. So people with disabilities, older adults. But there's a lot kind of left open to the MPO's discretion about how you address that in the plan.
Right. And
historically, the approach was, I think, a little bit more just looking after the fact. We would see what projects do we have and where do they fall, in our TPO area relative to these communities. And so we use census data to map, where the communities of concern are from this kind of transportation disadvantaged holistic perspective. And then we would just see, how much funding went to those areas and what kind of projects. This time we're putting it on the front end, and we're trying to really integrate equity into the plan in a much more robust way than we've done in the past, and acknowledging that it's an evolving process, and we're learning, and we'll probably do something better next time as well, and it's changing with every plan. But we have identified the equity emphasis areas. So again, it's like 8 or 9 different components or indicators that go into that are on the story map on our website, and we've layered this across the TPO region to say where are these concentrations of vulnerable populations, and have also opened that up to public input. So we know that the census data might not capture everything. It might not capture, a block or a small neighborhood. We're using the block group level of census data, which is a pretty small geography, but it might not capture, a street that might have a lot of older adults living on it or something. And so we wanted to make sure, again, hey, did we miss anything? Are there any communities that we need to include in this for later in the process, where we go and say, what projects are improving infrastructure conditions in equity emphasis areas? What projects are improving multimodal access to transit, safety, and equity emphasis areas? So we look at that in the project evaluation process and are giving points to projects that are actively addressing those things. So that, in that way, it's a lot more integrated than it was in the past. And then just briefly, the level of traffic stress for walking and biking story map also explains level of traffic stress is a bit of a wonky term, but it's the idea of how stressful is it to walk or bike in certain areas, and identifying those areas. And there's an opportunity on that story map for people to, draw a line on a map or put a point on a map and say, hey, this intersection is impossible to cross with a bike, or walking here makes me fear for my life, or whatever it might be. And again, using that feedback to identify projects that are helping reduce level of traffic stress for people who are walking and biking, and specifically looking at reducing the gaps in the network, because many times, you might have a quiet residential street that's really easy to bike on, and then on the other side of an intersection, another quiet residential street that's really easy to bike on, but that intersection can just feel daunting and impossible to cross. And so that, one pinch point might be what's preventing somebody from taking a bike ride for a trip that otherwise would be really interested in doing that. We know that from a lot of national surveys that most people fall in this sort of interested but concerned class of people who would bike.
There's that kind of barrier to entry.
Exactly.
I'm new to this and I don't want to get run over, but I would like to ride my bike. Yeah.
I'd like to have the opportunity to do this safely, but I feel concerned, and probably rightly so in a lot of places, because it can be daunting. And so identifying those the gaps in that low stress network, and then kind of channeling priorities and encouraging through the RTP process for our jurisdictions to look at those areas. It kind of helps, do the most with limited funding again to make an improvement in that situation. And then the understanding the transportation improvement program story map I spoke to a little bit earlier, but it just kind of gets into that, like, what's the RTP and what's the TIP especially, and then how does that relate to the RTP, and how do these two acronym things go together to get stuff
so
built.
That one's more of an explanatory map for the person looking at it, whereas the other three are more interactive in terms of, this is what I am feeling is important, is this location on the community resources map, or this route on the level of stress map, or this community in the equity map.
Exactly. Yep. And all of those are open through the end of August for people to provide input on.
Great. I will put links to all of those in the show notes. I want to keep moving and start talking a little bit more about how, dive into the details more of how these projects for the RTP are selected. I want to start kind of high level. The RTP projects are split into three categories. So there's projects improving transportation within the community, between the community and the region, and from region to region. And this was all kind of on the website. So can you talk about these categories more specifically, especially how they're defined? You say community to community or region to region. What is the size of that community or that region? Are we talking the whole TPO region as that definition, or are we talking kind of smaller, Chattanooga to Cleveland?
So when we talk about the smallest scale, it's any smaller neighborhood in any of the TPO boundary. So that particular scale is talking about more where you live and that immediate vicinity, your kind of immediate neighborhood, where the community to region is kind of between those areas, but still anywhere in the TPO boundary, right? The region to region is about our entire region interacting as a region with other outside places. So when you think about projects and what they do from the standpoint of, let's just say, commuting traffic or goods movement, then those three scales we're talking about for the region to region coming into our region or going out of our region, and for the smallest we're talking about moving within that neighborhood. Right. So whether it's goods movement in that neighborhood or whether it's people movement. So that's the way the scale is thought about from a functional standpoint. For the project evaluation process itself, we're tagging projects for their purpose. So when they get submitted, the first thing that we do is identify the predominant purpose for that project, right? What is the project intended to do? It may do a lot of things, but there's a primary purpose. And so we identify that, and then we determine, which of the three scales does it seem to make the most sense, belong to, based on those general definitions of the function for what's happening at that scale. It's interesting, the iterations, though, of this, because this will be, for the 2050 plan, this will be the third iteration of this framework and the use of these scales, or this scaled approach to ranking projects. And we're still kind of honing in on what that definition is for each scale, because you can see where a project might fall in the community to region, but also be probably a region to region because it's part of a network going out of the region to another region. So sometimes that's a little objective or subjective in the way that we end up tagging them, but we're getting better at it and trying to maintain some level of consistency with looking at that approach. The way the scoring is set up for those tagged projects is by these goals, or we have national goals that are federal requirements, and we thought if we can utilize the national goals that align with like project type and purpose, and what is the project intended to do, then we can kind of set up weighted measures within the scales for each of those goal areas or the type of purpose project that it is. So, for instance, system maintenance, so maintenance projects versus a congestion reduction type project, or a economic growth kind of project, to move goods more efficiently. Safety, security, environment. So we have, I think there's 7 or 8 of them. A lot of this I don't keep up here. I have to go look. So I'm looking at some. So if I pause, it's as I'm trying to look or think about that.
I want to get into those specific criteria that each project is weighted on. But before we do that, I want to clarify something about those 3 categories of community to region, region to region. When you come up with the full list of RTP projects, is there any specific weighting you're targeting in terms of how many are in the community to region, how many are in the region to region, etc.? Or is this more of ways to analyze, it's just a different way to analyze each project and it doesn't matter how many are in each bucket?
It doesn't matter how many are in each.
So it just changes the way that you analyze each project. And so it doesn't matter if a jurisdiction comes to you with projects that are all region to region.
No, it doesn't matter.
You'll look at those and you'll look at them and you'll weight them differently internally, and we'll talk about those weightings, but it doesn't matter that one jurisdiction has all region to region and one has all community. Okay.
No, it doesn't matter. We have looked at, we wanted to evaluate, was the framework helpful? So the first time we rolled it out, we wanted to evaluate, and we wrote a white paper on it published by the Transportation Research Board, which is a group of the National Academies of Science, I think. But in doing that and looking back, that's where I say it's produced a mixture of projects, because we did see a number of projects meeting all 3 scales, and I don't know that we looked at whether jurisdictions were actually submitting multiple scale, projects within each of the scales or not. But we did see a variety of projects coming under each of the scales, so it's not like one scale doesn't have very many projects. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we did look back to see that and evaluate whether or not we were getting projects in all 3 scales.
So and you started to talk about these categories, and I want to just list them all off from what I saw on the website. The RTP projects are weighted on system maintenance, congestion reduction, safety and security, economic growth / freight movement, environmental sustainability, and system reliability. And so you're saying that the way that these 3 scales are split up is all of these 6 goals that I just listed are weighted differently depending on the scale of the project.
Exactly.
Are there any measurements available for how previous projects have succeeded and failed, and how does that get worked into the process?
There's not really. We've looked at different instances of where an issue came up, and we might have looked at a particular instance or project situation, but there's not a method. We don't have a current developed process method for that. I think one project that I saw where there was an early pre kind of what's happening at this location and how can we fix it discussion, and then an actual project that was implemented and looking again and evaluating that was the roundabouts out at 153 and the Chickamauga Dam. Those roundabouts, before they went in, there was a lot of conversation about, this is a terrible intersection, it's difficult, it's congested, and once the roundabouts were put in, it was just, and those were probably the biggest at the time, and some of the first that were put in, and it was shocking, the free flow traffic situation following the implementation of the roundabout. So
right. Yeah, I guess the reason I ask is, if there was a project, say, in the 2045 RTP or maybe the 2040 RTP where they added a lane and the stated purpose was to reduce congestion from region to region, and then you go back 5 years later and say, hey, did this added lane actually reduce congestion or not? Should we do these kinds of projects in the future?
The closest we get is something directed completely at that example, which is the congestion management process. So in that mandated process, there is a requirement and an expectation to be evaluating those things periodically, and as you update the congestion management process each time you're sort of going into a regional transportation plan cycle. You can have a standalone process, or it can be integrated into the regional transportation plan. Right now we have a standalone process, and we are working currently on what that evaluation process looks like. So a different team in the regional planning agency is working on that, and they have a 2018 congestion evaluation report out right now that's on the website. So that would be an instance where they're evaluating what has been the change in congestion in places, and the next kind of, I guess, logical step would be to start looking then at the strategies or the projects and which ones are working, not working. Were there ones that did a better job even if they worked? Are there ones that did a better job in certain locations or in certain instances? So your example is good, and I think we're kind of moving in that direction, to try to get more to the point of which projects are actually resulting in better outcomes. Right, exactly. Because most of what the plan is about what we think would happen, right? So what about the look back? What about that look back and comparison of, did the projects that got selected and implemented do what we thought they would do? And I think it's just a lot of resources. Probably the reason we haven't is, if you look at the resources and the staff that we have to do the big job that we're doing, it's pretty small in comparison to a lot of other places. I mean, the NPOs are the NPOs all across the country. The amount of staff that's to them, though, is quite variable. And there are a lot that do the same things that we do, but have double, triple our staff, or maybe more. And so maybe it's a little bit of the resource thing and the why that we haven't gotten there yet. Because it's almost like there's a duplicate team doing that and running that all the same time that you're trying to continue to do this work.
And I think it speaks to a broader point as well, that our transportation system doesn't operate in a vacuum. And so the transportation plan can influence the transportation projects and strategies and things kind of related specifically to the transportation network. And a project can be designed for, a certain purpose with a certain goal in mind. And if everything else that impacts the transportation system, like development patterns and, different approaches to land development, especially if those things change over time, then a project may have been designed for a goal and it may have been meeting that goal that it was designed for, but now it's being expected to do a different thing, right? Like a bridge is a good example. A bridge may have been designed to carry, X amount of vehicular traffic per day, but if other things that impact the transportation system are doubling or tripling that amount of traffic, then it has to either be retrofitted to try to get shoehorned into this thing that it wasn't designed for originally, or it'll
rebuild
fail, or you rebuild it. And so I think it's really important. And I think probably one of the biggest things I would hope that people that don't think about transportation planning a lot would walk away from this conversation understanding is that it's not one system, transportation and the way that our community physically develops and other ways about where destinations are, like the community resources that we look at, it's one system. And so it has to kind of it relies on integration to really function to the best capacity possible. And so we do try to do that. And we're in a unique situation here, being a TPO staff within a regional planning agency, and so we have that dialogue.
Great.
And not a lot of places do, and so we, for example, with monthly rezoning requests, we provide comments on, those applications from the long-range plan perspective. Are there any projects in the long-range plan planned for this area? Is the site served by public transit? We look at other studies and reports that we've done about street connectivity and that sort of thing, and provide comments, from that TPO perspective.
Right.
In an effort to, connect the dots to the highest degree possible for the region.
That's fantastic, because that's something I feel like people understand in their gut, the relationship between land use and transportation. I was at the county commission meeting this week, and they were doing some changes to the subdivision regulations that would allow for some smaller lots, and they were rezoning a few areas to allow a new subdivision on, I think it was Ringgold Road. There was a lot of pushback because of transportation issues. That was the number one thing that was brought up in the commission meeting, was transportation. And so I feel like when you see land uses changing, people immediately think about transportation, but they're not necessarily always thinking about how linked they are, and how the transportation can also impact the land use that's getting put in. So I'm really glad to hear that that's working well with the TPO being part of the regional planning agency. I am wondering, you guys will hopefully enjoy answering this question, but who would citizens talk to get you more staff and get you more resources, knowing that transportation, again, this is something I hear all the time when people make complaints about Chattanooga. The biggest complaint is almost always our roads are too congested and we can't handle any more subdivisions. So if we wanted to get the resources to actually have a good plan for that, who would people talk to?
Well, I think we always encourage people to talk to their elected representation at whatever level, right? So obviously we touch all levels. We touch the locals in all of the jurisdictions we mentioned. There are 19 of them that are on the map. If you go to the website for our TPO area, there are 19 jurisdictions there. We work with the state, and we also work with our federal partners. And oftentimes I think the community doesn't think about the federal partners either. Like, we're all in it together, and all of the decisions that get made at all of those levels, and including our separate boards, so the TPO board, our planning commission, state legislature, that all those decisions in the capacities that touch the physical built environment, whether it's transportation or land use, have a direct relationship to the outcomes that we see.
Right.
It is an easy thing to understand that they're linked together, but it becomes complicated and nuanced when you think about how do you deliver the most efficient system from a transportation standpoint, from a land use standpoint, because there are so many partners and so many moving pieces that are happening at different times. So I do think that elected representation is always a good place to start. We encourage people to spend time with their elected officials, and thinking about transportation, it's one to just have those conversations about what you're experiencing, whether it's in your neighborhood or whether it is kind of on that larger platform of moving within this community, moving from the community to region, or moving outside of our region and coming back in. What do you see when you go somewhere else? And you come back in, do you see differences, and what are they? And I think they can then have a direct relationship to staffing or funding for the work that we do, or more work that we would need to do.
And that's where the education component comes in as well. I think I feel like sometimes running a public engagement process related to this work, it's a big ask to get people to think 25 years in the future and kind of get on board with the long range nature of what something like an RTP is trying to do. it's a lot easier, like you were saying, for folks to kind of see like this road has become a problem for me today. Like what's going to be done today? And we're talking about, especially the larger roadway projects in the RTP can take 5-10 years, before something happens. You've got a totally different set of people living in a community, or totally different land use patterns that might be happening on the ground there. And so it's a lot to think that far into the future, but I ask that people kind of make the journey with us a little bit, to the extent that they can, to think through, if it starts with a problem or a challenge that I'm experiencing today, how do I think long term about, what my priorities might be, or what I might want to contribute to this process for the future, to maybe have a different set of circumstances that I'm dealing with in the future as opposed to today, but with the understanding that it's a long range vision setting, 2050.
Right. Well, I've been here 20 years and I'm just seeing some projects come to fruition that may have been in a transportation plan when I first started. And they take a long time. And I've thought about, when you asked that about who to talk to, one thing that happens at every county commission or city council in any jurisdiction is usually there's time for public questions or public comment. And I don't know that I see a whole lot of people that take the opportunity to address the bodies. And I do appreciate some of our council or commissioners in our area of Hamilton County have engaged in more frequent dialogue with their districts and the neighborhoods, and we see it both in the county and in the city, and I applaud those efforts to speak more frequently with the community and talk about those things, because if it is long term and it is, or there are certain things that might happen in a particular area because of a change in development, or maybe it's just population growth. I mean, we've seen areas get, see a kind of a one-time deal where there was a move-in because there were new homes, or it became a vibrant area for a reason. Like, just something happened there, right? And you just saw an influx of people. And when that happens, it changes things. But you won't know if we're not having these routine conversations with one another about what's happening there. So I think those have been really great opportunities for elected representation in the community to talk and then bring that back to the body, the legislative body. And all that is a process. And seeing that, or trying to see that as a public citizen work and be involved in that, is really important. It's just a civic duty to be involved.
I agree. I think that's a pretty good place to start wrapping things up. Do y'all want to talk about kind of what's the upcoming schedule and what people should be on the lookout for?
Yes, absolutely. So August 25th, we have our first public meeting. It's really more of an open house where we're just going to have a lot of the content from the story maps on our website right now presented in an open house format. And so August 25th will be the in-person opportunity for that here at the Development Resource Center. That evening we'll have Melissa and I and some other staff working on the TPO here in person to just talk through what we're seeing so far and from our analysis, to date, and what we've heard from people to date about the plan. However, we're also going to have a virtual open house for about that same week, that kind of last week in August window. So if people can't come to the in-person open house on August 25th, there will be a longer, I think it's about 5 or 6 days, where the same input opportunities and all the same information will be available in a virtual open house format. It's a really cool, unique way that we haven't done before to present that information, and it kind of feels on the website that we're using for that like you're in a room and you're going around to different boards. So both of those input opportunities coming up in August, at the end of August, and the survey's open through the end of August as well to get involved. And on the website too, there's a schedule kind of at a glance for the whole plan. So it's scheduled for adoption in January 2024. It takes a long time, but it's really more front loaded with public input. Most of 2023 is kind of back and forth with, state and federal partners reviewing what's pretty much the baked plan at that point. So this year, 2021, and next year, 2022, are most of the really robust public engagement opportunities. So check out that calendar on the website, and you'll be able to see, when we're kind of planning to have different activities throughout the process.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for the hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you
for
so
having
much,
us.
and thanks for listening. Yeah.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Chattanooga Civics. Our music was written and recorded by Kevin MacLeod. If you have any questions or feedback, please send me an email at chattanoogacivics@gmail.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @chatcivics, or visit the website chattanoogacivics.com. Thanks for listening.